Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here. This is one of my favorite topics. What I'm going to try to do today is inject a bit of optimism in the idea about reform. And the way I'm going to do that is by looking at historical episodes in which special interests have actually been beaten. So by way of sort of beginning the discussion, I want to bring you guys back a few years ago to one of the fiscal cliffs. I think we went over 2 or 3 of them, but this was probably the biggie. So January 1st, 2013, Congress had just signed and Congress had just passed and the president had signed a major deal to avert the fiscal cliff. And the way the president characterized it is he hearkened back to his campaign platform, which was essentially to repeal the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest earners. And the way he characterized it is a central promise in my campaign for president was to change the tax code that was too skewed towards the wealthy at the expense of working middle-class Americans. And he went on to say that tonight we've done that, and thanks to the votes of both Democrats and Republicans, I will sign a law that raises taxes on the wealthiest 2% of Americans. So notice that one of the big themes that he's stressing here is that there are a few narrow groups that have benefited, and so we're going to try to raise taxes on them. But over the next couple weeks, people started digging into the bill, and the interesting thing, of course, that they found is that it was riddled with a lot of special interest loopholes. So, for example, manufacturers of green homes received $650 billion in tax privileges. Hollywood production companies received $430 billion. And then even makers of rum received $222 million. And there's also, we could put NASCAR and a few others in there. Interestingly enough, people then started adding up these costs and comparing them to the revenue raised. The amazing thing is that the revenue lost in special interest privileges, in special interest tax code giveaways, exceeded the revenue gained in raising taxes on the top 2%. So the president could have achieved his number one goal of essentially rolling back what he saw as privileges to the wealthy and few. He could have done it simply by closing loopholes rather than raising taxes. This is from a president, of course, who's 270 times during his term has given speeches assailing the undue influence and power of special interests. Now, to be sure to be bipartisan, this is not a Democratic problem. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan famously talked about special interests as well. In an Oval Office speech in 1985, he said, "For 3 decades now, families have paid the freight of the special interests, and now families are in trouble." This was in a speech in which he was advocating for tax reform. But that president, of course, also had policies that privileged small, particular special interests, including a 10-fold increase in tariffs on Japanese motorcycles that was asked for by Harley-Davidson. And Harley-Davidson was basically the only firm that benefited from this. And including, of course, in 1986, reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank, which is something that our friends at the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce have been recently reminding everybody that Reagan liked XM as well. So this from a president who 151 times during his 2 terms in office assailed the undue influence and untoward power of special interests. So how is it that presidents of both parties for the better part of 2 centuries have been united in calling for an end to privileges to special interests, and yet almost at the same breath still bend over backwards to privilege these special interests? Well, one thing I think first to get a handle on it is just what are we talking about when we're talking about special interests. So this was a special concern of James Madison, and probably in the most important of the Federalist Papers, still political scientists consider it one of the most important contributions to political science by any American. Federalist 10 was dedicated to what Madison called the problem of faction. Today we would call it a problem of special interests. And what he said is, the way he defined a faction is a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion or interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So one thing to get clear here is, think about this. All of us, in one way or another, of course, is a special interest. We are all special, right? It's Mother's Day. All of our mothers probably raised us to tell that to know that we are special, and we share certain characteristics with other people. If you have the same job as somebody else in the country, you would benefit from legislation that would raise barriers to entry into that field. If you like consuming the same product as another person in the country, you would benefit from subsidies for that product. And if you are a member, and if you live anywhere in the country, 70,000 of your closest neighbors, of course, stand to benefit when a company in your district receives some sort of special contract. So we are all potentially special interests. And Madison talked about this, and he has this nice phrase about it's in our nature, it's baked into our nature that humans form and coalesce around common interests. And we don't want to get rid of that. The problem is indulging special interests. The problem is in government decisions that actually are adverse to either the rights or the interests of the rest of the public. So let me give you a little sense of how public choice economists and then political scientists think about how special interests have power. So I was at a barbecue a couple months ago, and I was talking to a friend, and he asked me, what are you working on? I said, I'm writing this book on why special interests usually win. And he said, well, boy, it's going to be a short book. It's just money, right? And actually, it's not money. It's something else. And so let me get at that. So the easiest way, I think, to describe the power of a special interest is to think of yourself at dinner with two friends. And you are all eyeing desserts. They're delicious desserts. And each dessert costs $12. Each of you is looking at a different one. And let's imagine that each of you values the dessert at $9. All right. The dessert has value, but it also has cost. Under this scenario, do you buy dessert? No, right? Okay, now, however, so we can describe this. If it's a private decision, your costs and benefits are internalized. You don't have dessert. But now imagine that, so no dessert. Now imagine, however, that the waiter comes up and he says, I'm sorry, I can't split the check. There's no way to give you guys separate checks, so I'm going to have to give you one. And one of your friends says, that's okay, we'll just split it 3 ways. Well, this friend has had a lot of iced tea, and he gets up and uses the restroom. While he's in the restroom, you and your other friend come up with a plan. You decide to log roll. You say, let's vote. I will vote for dessert for you so long as you vote for dessert for me, and we both vote for no dessert for our buddy who just came up with this scheme, right? So now, this changes the calculus. Now it's a public decision. Now, what you're looking at is 2 desserts, each costing $12 for a total of $24, but you split that 3 ways. So your fraction of the cost is now 24 divided by 3, which is just 8. So now, for a cost of $8 and a dessert you value at $9, what do? Do you vote for dessert? Yeah, and so does your friend. And so the table gets $24 worth of dessert, $18 value that it spends $24 on. In a word, that's inefficient, right? It's also inequitable because your friend, of course, pays $8 for nothing, right? So this essentially is the problem of special interests. And this involves a couple of things that are going on. One, it involves concentrated benefits on a subset of the group, right? 2 out of the 3 get something and the third doesn't. The other thing that it involves is log rolling, legislative log rolling. I'll vote for your bill if you vote for mine, right? And this happens whether it's dredging the port in Houston, or whether it is paying for trying to save some military program. In the Washington Post this morning, there was a story about a New York congressman inserting language an appropriations bill that asked the Army to look at some ladders that happen to be made in New York. So it happens in all sorts of legislation where congressmen agree to vote for one another's bills. And this is sort of normal politics, right? But there's actually another dimension here that makes it worse than this. So, of course, in the real world, we don't live in democracies of three. We live in representative democracies where hundreds of millions of people vote, and there are special interests who lobby. Now, let's take one program, the sugar program. So every year, Americans lend sugar producers about $1.1 billion a year, okay? So think about the costs that this imposes on typical Americans. So it's spread over 314 million citizens. This comes out to about $3.50 a year that each of you write a check to sugar producers, right? I hasten to add, this is not the only privilege that sugar producers benefit from. There's also barriers to entry, barriers to foreign competition. There's also price regulations that artificially raise the price. But let's just assume this is the only thing. Okay, so now think about how many of you are ready to go form a political action committee, hire some lobbyists, get organized, fund a campaign, get some paid media, get some earned media, and come to Washington and fight to save yourselves $3.50 every year in extra costs, right? How many of you are with me ready to join in this cause? Nobody, right? One guy. Thank you. I'm anti-amendment. So now, but think about the benefit side of this. So this same money is concentrated on just 3 firms. So just 3 firms receive about $200 billion each. And it's only about 16 or 17 firms total that receive any sort of sugar subsidies. So now what about the interests of these firms? Do you think 3 firms are going to get together and form a political action committee, get paid and earned media, and organize a political campaign for their benefit? Absolutely. So notice something. Notice my friend who says, oh, it's going to be a short book because the power of special interests is all about money. No, because who has more money, 314 million Americans or 3 firms? Clearly, 314 million Americans have a lot more money than 3 firms, right? But it's not money. It's actually, ironically enough, being small is helpful. A political science or economist named Mansur Olson wrote some really interesting books in the middle of the century on this problem, and his illustration is that his point is that special interests actually gain by being small, ironically. So it's a tyranny of the few. So you might say, well, $3.50 is negligible. Who cares? But of course, sugar isn't the only thing that we pay a higher price for because of protectionism. All sorts of things, including anything that contains steel, anything that's shipped, anything that has cotton in it or textiles in it. All of these things are artificially higher because of protectionism or special interest privilege. And of course, protectionism isn't the only way that government can privilege particular firms or industries. So a few years ago, I wrote a paper in which I went through and looked at all the different ways that special interests benefit from particular government favors. And there's a lot of them. There's obviously bailouts. There's loan guarantees. In some cases, local governments just grant monopolies. But no matter how policies privilege particular firms or industries, whatever its guise, as I wrote in the paper, it ends up being an extraordinarily destructive force. So it misdirects resources, it impedes genuine economic progress, it breeds corruption, it undermines the legitimacy of both the government and the private sector. And we see this, one of the terms you may have encountered is the idea of rent seeking. And this is the idea of contriving exclusivity. And when you look across countries, at those countries in which privileges are handed to particular firms or industries, there is a very strong correlation, statistically speaking, negative correlation between government-granted privilege and growth. Whereas those societies and those times and places in which it's an open society where privileges aren't granted, you tend to grow a lot faster. Many of you may have seen a new book by Asamoglu and Robinson called Why Nations Fail. The entire book is 400 or 500 pages documenting how it is that different societies in which privileges are handed to firms tend to do much worse, rent-seeking societies tend to do much worse than societies that are open to new competition and don't privilege particular firms or industries. Okay, so I got in some trouble with my wife, who's actually here today, and I handed this paper to my daughter and her best friend, and for some reason it didn't go over particularly well. They didn't care for it. So I decided I need to try to come up with a better, more optimistic view of it. And so that's really my current project, is trying to understand, while public choice economics and political science research suggests that special interests really do, in many cases, have an upper hand. Small, concentrated interests have an upper hand over large interests. We can, nevertheless, identify exceptions to the rule, instances in which general interests have prevailed over special interests. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the time here is dig into a few of these examples, and we can talk about potentially where they might apply today in putting together coalitions that try to roll back special interests. Okay, so really the story begins right at the beginning of the Republic. So under the Articles of Confederation, you may know, the states had the authority to impose barriers to trade with one another. So they could impose quotas and they could impose tariffs. And what this did is it choked off trade within the United States. James Madison had a very nice way of putting it, and he said, New Jersey, placed between Philadelphia and New York, was likened to a cask tapped at both ends, and North Carolina to a patient bleeding from both arms. So in his view, this was drying up the arteries of commerce and making the United States, making the states under the Articles of Confederation significantly poorer than they needed to be. And we'd had 1776, of course, is an important year, not just for the Declaration of Independence, but because that's also the year in which Adam Smith wrote one of the more impassioned arguments for free trade. So what they did is Madison wrote letters actually from Mount Vernon. He used his friend Washington's eminence to make a case for bringing the states together and having a convention to figure out what do we do about getting rid of the ability for states to impose barriers to trade. They called for a convention in Annapolis, Maryland. And in particular, this was a good place to have it because Virginia and Maryland had recently been in a very heated battle over trying to tax one another on trade on the Potomac. And out of that convention, as you may know, this actually was the proximate cause for a constitutional convention, because in Annapolis, they then wrote a letter to Congress, and they said, hey, you ought to have a constitutional convention amending the Articles of Confederation. And when the convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, one of the first provisions adopted to the new Constitution was a rule forbidding states from imposing barriers to trade. No state is allowed to impose import or export duties except for those that might be necessary for inspection laws. And the ones when they do have that exception, when states are allowed to impose some sort of limit on inspection laws, they don't get to keep the revenue. So if you go to Hawaii, you notice, Hawaii will inspect your stuff, bringing it in and out. Any revenue that they obtain there has to go to the federal government. So this deprives essentially the states from an incentive to be able to try to put this barrier to trade. So one of the things that was interesting, though, is for many, many years, people basically took Madison at his word. Then in the 1950s and 60s, a industrious economic historian started piling into the statistics on barriers to trade under the Articles of Confederation. These are a few of his papers. The interesting thing he found was that Madison really exaggerated the extent to which the states were impeding one another in barriers to trade. And what it turns out, we now have a better understanding of this, is that a huge force for why they were able to get a ban in the Constitution on interstate barriers to trade was that states that are major exporting states, like Virginia, exporting tobacco, they are harmed from these barriers to trade. And exporters are an interesting group, right? Because exporters are a small, concentrated interest that typically is in favor of freer trade. That typically their interest is aligned with the general interest. And so their advocacy for this was really important. Now, I actually believe Madison was almost certainly onto something, that the states, if they didn't have major barriers to trade, they certainly would have eventually. Most governments do erect barriers to trade. It's sort of a natural, a very natural progression. But his foresight allowed the government to adopt a institutional change that kept that in check, kept this natural force from progressing, and allowed the United States to be the largest free trade zone in the world. And this is a big part of the reason why the United States took off economically over the next several decades. Okay? So that's one example. Let me give you another example. This one is free international trade. So let's look back at U.S. tariffs on dutiable imports. So in 1932, the average tariff on dutiable imports was 59%, and now it's below 5%. So this is a pretty extraordinary triumph of economic freedom over special interest pleading, and it's something that you wouldn't, that logic of the cakes, the desserts that Mansur Olson illustrated, it wouldn't predict this, right? Now it's not all clean. Other non-tariff barriers to trade have gone up a little bit, but by almost any objective measure, trade is much more liberalized now than it was a century ago or a half a century ago. How did this happen? Well, one thing that's important is, of course, I mentioned Adam Smith in 1776 writing this eloquent defense of free trade. His wasn't the only. There was Ricardo and there was Mill, and then by the 1930s and 40s and 50s, nearly all of the economics profession was unanimously behind the idea of free trade. And this is still, to this day, this is one of those things when you poll academic economists, you get 90-95% agreement that free trade is beneficial for both trading parties. So one thing that's very helpful here is you have a sort of the scientific community coalescing around one concept. So that intellectual ammunition is very important. But you needed more than that. And it was a guy named Cordell Hull who helped come up with the idea of something more. So Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt. And he had been a former member of Congress, a Southern Democrat. And like all Southern Democrats, at the time, he was an enthusiastic free trader. And he was sort of an intuitive free trader. He would always tell these stories to his colleagues about two farmers that one has hogs and one has grain, and one loses some hogs one year and the other loses some grain one year, and they trade and they both are better off. He sort of grasped this. And what Cordell Hull believed is, as a former member of Congress, he thought that the problem with trade policy was that it was in the hands of Congress. The median congressman, he said, is typically in favor of free trade deals, but they want exceptions to this particular firm in their district. They want to have some sort of barrier to trade for the firm that's in their district. All right, this is typical incentives, right? And so what he did was he came up with this idea, eventually called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which we now would call fast-track trade negotiation power. So what this does is, first of all, you let congressmen cast a vote, a prominent, conspicuous vote for free trade, and then you hand the power over to the president to actually negotiate reciprocal tariff agreements with other countries, lowering barriers to trade. And the president is the one who, and Congress agrees to vote on this with just an up or down, and they bind themselves, they will not amend it, okay? So he goes to Roosevelt and he pitches this plan. Roosevelt was not, unlike Hull, was not exactly a intuitive free trader, but he pitches Roosevelt on it for foreign policy reasons. He says this would be really good to help the war effort with our allies, Australia, Canada, the UK. It would be really good to have free trade agreements with them. And so Roosevelt gets behind it, throws his political weight behind it. But there was something else that was going on here. World War II happened to decimate European exporters, and U.S. exporters, this gave them a leg up in the world. And U.S. exporters are like those Virginia tobacco exporters, are a small concentrated interest that happens to be aligned with the general interest, that happens to favor free trade. And so U.S. exporters became a potent political force behind the Reciprocal Tariff Agreements Act. They also happen to be located in Republican districts. So the century-long Republican opposition to free trade started to crumble at this point too. So all these things came together, and then the Reciprocal Tariff Agreements Act kept it going. I'll give you one more example, and then I'm going to try to pull out some lessons learned from these examples, and we can open it up. So I want to talk about base closings. So basically, since the 1950s, the brass and the military have identified a problem with too many bases, more bases than is strategically, militarily necessary. But Congress, of course, doesn't like to close bases. Again, following incentives, nobody in the district wants to lose so many jobs. Concentrated benefits on a few people in a district, even though the costs are spread out over 314 million Americans. So obviously, the special interests typically win. Well, having seen this and tried to find ways to limit spending for a number of years, Senator Phil Gramm and Congressman Dick Armey came up with another idea. And their idea, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, is the Brac Commission. So the idea with the Brac Commission is, again, you give Congress an ability to vote in favor of closing bases. But Congress does not get to decide which particular bases are going to be closed. Instead, that is given to an independent commission that gets the authority to decide which particular bases, and Congress just makes an up or down vote. Now, how many people have seen the House of Cards episode with the Brac Commission? So now one thing about that, so in the House of Cards episode with the Brac Commission, the congressman, I can't remember his name, what's his name? Peter Russo, yeah, okay. So he, for political reasons, one of his allies asked to basically fall on his sword and go in front of the commission and not defend the base closing. So the House of Cards is based on a British version of the show, and they get some things wrong. And one of the things they get wrong here is that that's not the way the Brac Commission works. What makes the Brac Commission work is that you give the ability of congressmen to go before the commission, get down on their knees and say, please don't close my base. And then make sure that there's enough votes to close the base anyway, right? So this it gives congresspeople who are humans, follow incentives, have incentives to privilege the special interests in their district. They're not bad people, obviously. It gives them an ability, gives them cover to make the tougher choice, right? And that's something that's key in all of these decisions. Well, it's and my colleague, I have a paper by my colleague Jerry Brito up there. It's a nice summary of the way the Brac Commission works. And it was enormously successful. Over the years, it's been responsible for closing 350 bases that the military had said were unnecessary. All right, so what are some of the lessons learned from these stories? And I have in the book that I'm writing, I've collected about 8 or 9 different stories, and so we can talk afterwards about how well some of these stories fit with it. So the first thing is, of course, the timing does matter. So sometimes it's a little bit of a stroke of luck. You have to, in Acevedo and Robinson's book, they call this a critical juncture. Sometimes history, you have to be able to strike when history presents you with an opportunity. By the way, this is something that people on the left and the right have identified. Milton Friedman famously talked about how when a crisis hits, you need to have the right ideas lying around for people to institute it. And of course, what did Rahm Emanuel say? He said crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Sometimes out of tragedies like the decimation of Europe, you can actually get things that make the world better, like liberalization of trade around the world. Another factor is that leadership matters. So both Ronald Reagan and Senator Bradley were important for tax reform in 1986. And one of the things you notice in a lot of these examples is quite often it's reformers from the opposite side of the political aisle that are able to do it, right? So it was important that Ronald Reagan was behind tax reform because tax reform had been a Democratic, central part of the Democratic platform since Harry Truman. And so you do something that's kind of that people aren't expecting, and that allows you, it's sort of in the same way that only Nixon could go to China, right? Only Ronald Reagan could do tax reform, and Bill Clinton could reform welfare. Sometimes and also Jimmy Carter could deregulate airline, trucking, and railroads, freight railroads. So another thing that's important is institutional reform. So one of the things that was lacking in the 1986 tax reform is that there was no institutional mechanism to keep it from just going back. So even though they cleared away a bunch of privileges in the tax code and closed a bunch of loopholes, within 3 or 4 years they were all back, and many more besides. So institutional reforms like the Reciprocal Tariff Agreements Act and the World Trade Organization and and Brac and legal mechanisms and constitutional mechanisms that change the incentives of politicians on a much more permanent basis are necessary. Another thing that you notice in all of these examples, I have an ox here, is that almost all of the examples involve many people having their oxes gored, right? So this was repeatedly, a number of people observed this in the 1986 tax reform, so long as everyone's ox was getting gored, people didn't mind it. Why? Because that, and only that, will make you interested in doing it. Because I'm okay having my ox being gored so long as I don't have to pay for the upkeep of all of your oxes, right? So go back to where I began. We are all special. We are all parts of special interests. It's very difficult to take away anyone's privilege, but you're going to encounter much less resistance to it if you do it if you're doing it for everyone at the same time, because then you actually get out of you actually offer somebody something in return. So in the case of tax reform, by closing all these loopholes, they were able to lower the top marginal tax rate from 50% down to 28%. That's a big carrot along with that stick. Same thing with the Reciprocal Tariff Agreements Act. Everybody, yes, they lost the protection for the one firm in their district, but that also meant that prices on thousands of goods and services were cheaper for their constituents. That changes the political calculus, right? This one is blatantly self-serving. I am at George Mason University, right? And so I am a special interest like everyone. But intellectual firepower does seem to be an important part of this. So whether it's Adam Smith articulating the benefits of free trade, or tax reform groups in the 1980s talking about doing studies showing that there's 350 major corporations that has zero tax liability in the last several years. That kind of intellectual firepower ammunition seems indispensable. Another thing I think that's particularly relevant for the mechanics of putting together a deal is you need to organize a way for Congress people to cast conspicuous votes in the general interest. This sort of seems obvious once you say it, but you have to give people an ability to vote loudly and proudly, right, for tax reform, for free trade, for the general interest. And then this part, also somewhat intuitive, but it's less practiced. Inconspicuous votes against their special interests. Give Congress people some cover when they're turning their back on the special interests. Give the congressman an ability to go down to the Brac Commission, get on their knees and say, please don't close my base, and then have it closed anyway, right? So giving some cover for that. And then finally, and you can see where this can potentially be a dangerous weapon, right? But special interests tend to beat other special interests. So if you think about free trade, almost always exporters have been a big advocate. Think about other special interests. Right now, there's obviously a big fight over XM. Delta, Southwest, other carriers that pay higher prices for planes and also lose market share to foreign carriers like Air India that receive the subsidies, they oppose XM. They are small concentrated interests that happen to be aligned with the general interest of the elimination of this privilege. So, and also think about how Uber has broken into the local taxi monopolies in a lot of cities. They are a small concentrated interest that happens to be aligned with the interest of consumers, right? And they're willing to break the taxi monopolies that municipalities have granted. So there it is. Those are the general lessons that I have that I'm seeing. But you all have a much better sense of this than I do, of course. So I'm curious to get your your views of this. How well does this story hang together? What are some holes in it? And what do you see as some are there things that are missing? Are there other things that we can add to it to make it more robust? Or have I described it essentially as you see it? So in my view, it's a much more optimistic picture than special interests always win, and that's the way it's always been, and we have no hope. So with that, I'm going to put up some contact information. I'd love to continue the conversation online afterwards too, but I'll open it up for conversation or for questions.